While I was growing up, my dad always made sure that my brother and I spent a lot of time outside. He wanted to make sure we had all the outdoor skills that he said would make us men. The thing is, I've always felt kind of paranoid in the woods. I always thought I needed to hide that from my dad, though. I didn't want to be a sissy and disappoint him. But I did get really good at scouting new trails and outfitting our campsites and all that stuff. It's not that I didn't like it, I just felt vulnerable out in the wild. Anyway, one year my dad got all excited about exploring the boundary waters in northern Minnesota. He then spent a couple weeks planning it out and finding the perfect campground, and within a few weeks we were off. A few days into the trip, it dawned on me that I was actually having a good time. My brother and I made friends with some other kids who were also there, and we found a great spot for cliff jumping at one of the lakes. The day after that, we headed out on a boat, and when the three of us were at a portage, we ran into some other campers who said they'd seen 2 moose swimming across the lake. We were excited to hear that, and were hoping for a chance to spot them. For some reason, I wasn't scared thinking of the moose, even though nowadays I realize how dangerous they can be. We had stopped paddling for the day, and were looking for a spot underneath a grove of trees to take a break. Once we found that, my brother then looked for a ledge where we could jump into the lake. While looking, we kept finding these huge stacks of rocks along the tree line. They weren't your typical little stacks that people usually make. They were made with super heavy rocks. Some of them were pretty precariously balanced, and my dad was yelling at us to keep away from them in case they fell over. He even tried to dismantle one that was close to the ledge that we wanted to jump off of. But the stones were too heavy for him to move. We finally found a good spot for jumping and spent an hour there before going back for dinner by the fire. For some reason, I was starting to get my old paranoid feelings back, even though we'd been having a great time. It didn't help that while we were eating, a weasel came running right through our campsite and into the water. At least we had a good laugh when we realized what it was. But the darker it got that day, the more I found myself wishing I could be at home. I eventually got settled into my sleeping bag, but I was having a hard time getting to sleep. I couldn't figure out why I'd gone from having fun to feeling like something was out to get me. I laid there until I heard my dad and brother start snoring, and then I felt really alone knowing that they were asleep. I wished I could just go to sleep without worrying, but I started freaking myself out just by listening to even the simple noises, like the leaves rustling. But that night the sounds were different. Even over the sound of my dad snoring, I kept hearing a soft thud over towards the lake. Our tent was probably about 200 feet from the water's edge, which didn't feel like a comfortable enough distance to me. I started wondering if those moose we'd heard about were nearby, but I didn't know if moose were nocturnal. Then I heard this incredibly loud splash. Since we had just heard about the moose that were swimming, I kept telling myself it must be them jumping into the water, but that didn't sound right either when I thought about it. I realized that it was unlikely that a moose would jump in. It would just walk in. All of a sudden, there was just this barrage of splashes. Dozens of splashes of things landing in the lake. Really heavy things. The lake sounded like it was just exploding when they hit. Definitely not moose. Then I started hearing this low howling that kept escalating into a loud whooping noise. I couldn't believe my dad and brother were sleeping through this. I decided I needed to risk a look out of the tent flap, so I unzipped it a tiny bit and slowly peered outside. When I looked out, I thought I was hallucinating. I could see a creature standing next to the water that looked in the moonlight like it was a giant hairy man. The howl was definitely coming from whatever that thing was. I was too scared to scream or even move, which is why I didn't wake up my dad or brother. Then I watched it take one of those incredibly heavy stones like the ones we had seen earlier and toss it into the lake like it was nothing. Then it lifted its mouth into the air and howled again. This time I snapped out of my incapacitated state and started shoving my dad to wake him up and whispering that something was wrong. I expected him to know what to do to scare that thing off. But instead, After he looked at it for a few minutes through the flap, he immediately zipped it back up and instructed me to stay completely still and quiet. His reaction freaked me out even more. I'd never seen my dad pause about anything, but he was visibly shaken. We listened for the better part of an hour while that thing raised hell out there. And then eventually we heard the sounds of it running off through the shallow water at the lake's edge. We stayed totally still for another 10 minutes, and then my dad barely unzipped the tent to look out. It was all quiet, and there was no sign of that thing. We heaved a huge sigh of relief when we realized we couldn't hear it anymore. My dad looked at me and said, if I didn't know better, I'd think we just saw Bigfoot. Well, that was the end of any hope for sleep for me. I still couldn't believe my brother had missed the whole thing. We got up at sunrise, and while we loaded everything up, it occurred to me that the spot we had camped in might be its home, and the stacks of rocks might be some type of boundary markers. And if so, I have no idea why it didn't roust us out of the tent and do away with us, but I sure am happy it didn't. The last few days have been pure hell. Be careful while thrift shopping, and if you feel something off about the item you want to purchase, do not buy it. Trust your gut. I wish I had. I bought an antique vase from a thrift store a few towns over when my wife and I went on a small weekend trip. I had never been to that thrift store before. It was dark and cramped, but full of some neat stuff, some of which included vintage clothing, various pieces of furniture, and a beautiful antique clay vase with native carvings of buffalo and birds. I set the vase in the center of my dining table, but when I stepped back to admire my work, a sense of uneasiness came over me. I tried to put it past me and went to take my dog on a walk. I called her to me, and I noticed the way she avoided my dining table. She steered hard clear of it, something she didn't do before. I attached her leash onto her vest and, out of curiosity, pulled her towards the dining table. She locked her limbs and snarled, her eyes fixated on the vase. I laughed. The weirdest things freaked that dog out. At one point during our walk, I heard humming from my left side, almost like if somebody had put their face right next to my ear. I whirled around, but nobody was there. It didn't sound like a mosquito. The voice was too melodic. When I got home, loud, fast footsteps came from behind me and through my front door, traveling throughout my house like some invisible man was running about before it came to a sudden stop. I froze while my dog barked her head off. There was nobody behind me, and I didn't see anything that could have caused that noise. I slowly shut the door behind me and tried to calm my dog. I was feeling pretty spooked, so I phoned my wife to see when she would be home. While I was waiting for her, I hopped in the shower. I closed my eyes, shampooing my hair and humming along to my music to try and calm myself. Something about my music sounded weird, though. My heart dropped to my stomach when I realized it wasn't my music that sounded weird, but a second voice humming another tune. It was the same tune I briefly heard while walking my dog earlier. My eyes flew open and immediately were met by another pair of eyes peeking at me from the front of my shower curtain, but then instantly ducking away the moment I registered them. I screamed. My dog rushed into the bathroom and I held her, shampoo still in my hair, dripping water everywhere. When my wife finally arrived, I was a wreck. I had somehow managed to wash out the rest of the soap from my hair and put on some clothes. I sat with my back against the living room wall and my dog by my side. I wouldn't even let her leave the room. Every so often I swore I heard that cursed humming, but I wouldn't have put it past myself for imagining it. I was so on edge. My wife tried to comfort me, but I could tell they didn't really believe me. They convinced me to go to bed, and after experiencing all that adrenaline, I was pretty tired. That night I awoke coughing so hard I was seeing spots. I coughed up and gasped for breath, gagging and throwing up. At last I coughed up a wad of hair. My wife and I stared at it in my hand. It was long, silky, and black, covered in my saliva. Neither of us knew what to say. In the silence, I heard it humming. "There it is!" I screamed. "The humming!" My wife's face was pale. "Let's deal with this in the morning," my wife said through thin lips. I was livid. What did she mean in the morning? We had to deal with this now. But something wasn't right about my wife's expression. It looked like she was trying to tell me something. She held out her arms for a hug, and hesitantly I leaned in. She breathed quietly in my ear. "She's here." I froze. As my wife held me, I looked up and saw her face, horrible and sunken in, peering at us through the vent on our ceiling. I shut my eyes and buried them into my wife's chest. Something told me that if she saw us try to leave now, things wouldn't end well for us. That night, I shut my dog in my room and would not let her leave my side. We heard clanging and crashing downstairs all night, but we knew nothing would come of going to check. The dark circles under my wife's eyes told me she slept about the same as I did. We headed to the kitchen for breakfast in silence, not knowing what to expect. The kitchen was a mess. The cabinets were wide open and empty, its contents shattered on my floor. It was a mess. And all around us there was the sound of a woman humming, evil and otherworldly. I screamed, "What the hell do you want from us?" I grabbed the vase and threw it out the window. It flew right back and landed squarely on the table. I had enough. I had watched enough horror movies to know if I stayed here it would not end well. I grabbed my keys and told my wife to get up. I dropped my wife and dog at a friend's and am now headed to the thrift shop I bought the vase from. I don't think this thing is going to give up, but the least I can do is to get it away from everybody I care about. I've seen the damage it can do. I'm 1 hour into a 2-hour drive to the store, and I swear every so often I see a pair of eyes staring back at me from my rearview mirror. I wanted to share a story with you about a terrible encounter I had with a creature that has left me horrified and shaken. I hope that by sharing my story, others can find the same solace in knowing that they're not alone in their experiences. I was sound asleep in my small apartment. I had been struggling to make ends meet for a while, working long hours to pay my bills and living alone in a cramped space. But despite the hardships, I always felt safe in my home. That all changed that night. I'm just an ordinary guy, working a not-so-great job and living paycheck to paycheck. I never believed in the supernatural, paranormal, or anything like that. What I saw that night, though, changed everything for me forever. I was awoken in the middle of the night by a strange noise coming from outside my window. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then I heard scratching and tapping on the glass. I got up to investigate, but as soon as I approached the window, I became paralyzed. There, just outside my window, was a creature, unlike anything I had ever seen. It was pale-skinned, with long limbs and fingers that ended in sharp claws. Its eyes were black pits, and its mouth was twisted in a gruesome snarl. It looked like a cross between a human and a wild animal, and it was staring right at me. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. I just stood there, staring back at the creature. And then, without warning, it threw itself through the window, landed on the floor, and then lunged at me. I jumped back and fell to the floor and watched as it gave me a strange look, and then jumped back out the window. I was too stunned to call for help, too scared to move from my spot. I was alone and vulnerable, and I didn't know what to do next. The creature was gone, but the damage it had caused was undeniable. I was looking at my window that was shattered, and glass was everywhere. I was still in shock, trying to process what had just happened, when I heard my kitchen window explode open. It was the creature, returning for another attack. The thing was now inside my apartment, and there was no doubt that it was coming for me. It was a living nightmare, and I didn't know how to defend myself. I jumped up and slammed my bedroom door closed. It clawed furiously at the door. I could hear its awful, labored breathing. In a moment of desperation, I reached for my phone and dialed 911. I could barely speak. My voice was trembling, and I couldn't get the words out. Luckily, the dispatcher could hear the panic in my voice and sent help. Eventually, the clawing stopped, and I listened intently to try and hear its next move. But instead, I heard it scurry away. When the police arrived, they found me huddled in a corner, shaking and probably sobbing. I've never felt so vulnerable and small in my life. They searched the apartment, but there was no sign of the creature. They took my statement and tried to calm me down, but I could sense that they didn't believe me. They asked me if I had any enemies or people who would wish me harm, asked if I had any family I could stay with that night. I told them no to all of these since I was broke and barely did anything other than work and sit at home. They said it was probably a burglar, but I know the truth. It wasn't until I was able to do some of my own research that I figured out what I had seen that night. It was a creature called the Rake, a paranormal entity that preys on its victims and leaves them traumatized. It's said to be a creature that's been around for centuries, lurking in the shadows and waiting for its next victim. As I learned more about the Rake, I began to realize that my experience wasn't unique at all. Others had encountered the creature and were left with similar feelings of terror and helplessness. It was a horrifying realization, but it also helped me to understand that I wasn't alone. Since that night, I've done everything I can to protect myself from the Rake. I've installed extra locks on my windows and doors, and I always keep a weapon within reach. I know that it might not be enough to keep me safe, but it makes me feel better than doing nothing. I still have nightmares about that night, and I know that I'll never fully recover from the trauma of the experience. But I also know that I'm not going to let the Rake control my life. I will keep fighting, pushing forward, and sharing my story with others who might be going through the same thing. Looking back on that night, I feel that I'm lucky to be alive. The Rake is a creature that most people never encounter, and from what I understand, those who do rarely survive. But I'm also grateful for the experience in a strange way. It's made me more aware of the dangers that lurk in the shadows, and it's given me a new appreciation for life. As a lifelong farmer living in rural Texas, I'm no stranger to the occasional predator taking down a chicken or two. But something strange has been happening on my farm lately, and it's got me spooked. My livestock has been getting killed in the most gruesome way possible, with huge claw marks and signs of being devoured horrendously. It's like nothing I've ever seen before. This wasn't the work of wolves, bears, or anything like that. I've done lots of research, and I'm highly convinced it can only be the work of a chupacabra. I live on a remote farm in Texas, surrounded by miles of fields and woods. It's a peaceful life, and I love what I do. But lately, something has been killing my livestock, and I'm not sure the best way to tackle the problem. It's affecting my livelihood and my sanity, and I need to get to the bottom of it. I've been a farmer for over 20 years, and I've never seen anything like this. I take pride in my work, and I care for my animals like they're my family. It's been tough to see them attacked and killed in such a violent manner. It all started a few weeks ago when I found one of my cows dead in the field. At first, I thought it was a mountain lion or a coyote, but the wounds were different. They were large and deep, and it looked like something had drained all the blood from the animal. I searched the area for any signs of what could have caused the wounds, and that's when I found the footprints. They were large, with long claws, and they didn't look like any animal print I'd ever seen before. I knew I had to find out what was causing this. Over the next few days, more of my animals were attacked and killed in the same way. I set up traps and cameras, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever was doing this. And then one night I saw it. I was sitting in my truck scrolling through social media on my phone when I saw a creature come from the woods. It was about the size of a large dog but had spikes on its back and long claws. It attacked one of my goats and took it down in seconds. I knew then that I was dealing with something far more dangerous than a coyote. I jumped out of the truck, grabbed my shotgun from the back, and ran after the animal. As soon as it saw me coming, it took off back into the woods. It was seriously fast, and I wasn't about to go trekking through the dark woods after it. Then the attacks became more frequent and more violent. Whatever this creature was, it seemed to be getting bolder and more aggressive. It wasn't just taking down my livestock anymore. It was coming closer to my home and my family. I started strategically parking my truck near my livestock and pretty much camping out in there to watch out for the predator and take care of it once and for all. One night I heard some stomping coming toward my livestock, and when I turned my truck's lights on, I saw the creature staring back at me. It was standing on two legs, and it had large yellow eyes and big awful teeth. I jumped out after it, and it escaped into the woods. I knew then that I had to do something before it was too late. I did some research, and that's when I first discovered that the creature I was dealing with could be a chupacabra, a legendary creature from Latin American folklore known for attacking and killing livestock. It was known for sucking the blood out of animals, and I'd never heard of any living creature doing that before. This had to be what I was dealing with. I reached out to some experts and authorities on the chupacabra, hoping to get some answers and advice. They told me that the creature was a nocturnal predator that was known for attacking and killing livestock, and that it had been spotted many times in Texas before. Finally, I felt validated and like I wasn't alone. They also said that the chupacabra was a mysterious and elusive creature, with many theories and legends surrounding it. Some people believe it's a government experiment gone wrong, while others think it's an alien or supernatural creature. Now I was positive that it was a chupacabra that had been attacking my animals, and I had to get serious about this and take action to protect my family and my livelihood as fast as possible. I set up traps and cameras and took extra precautions to keep my family and animals safe. And after weeks of waiting and watching, I finally caught the creature on camera. As I watched the footage, I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief and closure. I finally had proof of what had been attacking my farm and knew what I was up against. But at the same time, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was still so much I didn't know about the chupacabra and the mysteries of the world. I reported my findings to the experts and authorities, hoping to contribute to the understanding of this elusive creature. I also shared my story with others, hoping to raise awareness and caution for those who may encounter the chupacabra or other mysterious creatures. Looking back on the experience, I realize how little we know about the world and the creatures that inhabit it. The chupacabra may be just a legend to some, but it's also a reminder that there's still so much we have yet to discover and understand. Any tips on how to catch a chupacabra would be appreciated. While I'm glad to have found an explanation for the attacks on my farm, I also feel helpless that I still haven't been able to trap or kill the creature. The day I finally get my hands on the beast, I'm going to throw one heck of a party. I got to tell you about this story that happened to me. It's all true. All of the stories are true. I know because I've seen that creature that people talk about. I can hardly believe it. Since Alex passed away, I just up and sold my house. Couldn't stand to live there anymore, so I bought a used little camper trailer and traded my car in for a pickup to haul it. Been traveling around since, and I've seen a lot of stuff, but nothing like what I saw on the way to Memphis. I wanted to go to Graceland because Alex always wanted to go there, and we never did. Stuff always got in the way, money or whatever. I decided to camp at Myuu Shelby Forest State Park. The guy at the visitor center looked like Paul Bunyan or something. Big beard, hat, flannel shirt, the whole deal. Since it was November, the park was pretty empty. It wasn't that cold, but people might have been getting ready for Thanksgiving, I don't know. Paul Bunyan took forever, putting something in his computer, and then said, I just want to tell you that apparently there have been a lot of Dogman sightings around. At least that's what people are calling it. Just so you know. I thought for sure he was messing with me, so I didn't say anything. I just wanted my campsite assignment. I was tired from driving all day. If you're scared of it, I can get you in a cabin. Probably safer, he says. I don't know anything about a Dogman, I say. People say it's only in Michigan, but I don't believe that. They also say you only see it in years ending in 7, but I don't believe that neither. I was getting sick of it at this point, so I said, what do you believe? Me, I think Dogman's prowling around this area. Hungry, maybe, he said. How do you know? I asked. I heard it howl. Don't sound like no wolf or coyote. Sounds different, he says. I didn't know what that meant, but I decided not to ask. Then he goes, "You sure you want to be out there by yourself? No one camping today, just in cabins. I got a cabin you can have." I'd figured out my money pretty strict and I knew I didn't have enough for a cabin, so I said, "No, just let me have a campsite." He shrugs and goes, "Suit yourself." Circles my site on a paper map and gives it to me. I drove over to the site and put the blocks under the trailer. It's a teardrop, so I didn't have much other setting up to do. Since it was cold, I just heated up some soup in the microwave and sat at the table to eat. Didn't hear anything except the usual forest sounds. Bugs, birds, squirrels. I was tired, so I got into my little trailer bed early and fell asleep right away. Didn't hear anything all night. In the morning it was still cold, so I stayed inside for a little bit, making some pancakes from one of those shake and pour mixes. Drank some coffee and read my Memphis tour guide. I decided to hike around the park before leaving, but when I got out of the trailer, something told me to check on my truck. One of the tires, the one on the wood side, not the roadside, was completely flat. I got down to look closer and I saw this ragged part, like something had been chewing on the tire. That was impossible, though. Nothing could have jaws powerful enough to chew a tire except a dinosaur, maybe. Something huge. But there it was. Whatever it was had teeth strong enough to puncture a tire. The hole wasn't that big, but like I said, the part around it looked chewed. I wasn't going anywhere until I got it fixed, but it was still pretty early, so I decided to go on the hike. Maybe I'd somehow figure out an answer. While I was walking, I saw a few tracks that could have been from a dog, but I couldn't be sure. They were too big, though, like as big as my shoe. No dogs that big. I decided to hike to the park office and see if Paul Bunyan was there. He was, so I told him I needed the name of a car repair shop. Told him something chewed a hole in my tire. He acted like that was totally normal and gave me a phone number. Weird dude. So I called the number and just told the guy I needed a tire fixed. He said he could send a tow. When I got off the phone, Paul Bunyan was staring at me. His actual name was Jeb, according to his name tag. "Dogman," he said. "Bit your tire." "No way," I said. He shrugged. Finally, they came and towed the truck. I rode along with them to the shop in the front seat. In total silence, mind you. But when the guy was done fixing it, he said, "What happened to that tire?" "Guy at the park thinks Dogman bit it," I said. "Put out some dog treats tonight. See if he eats them," the guy said. Apparently the whole town was nuts. "I don't have any," I told him. He gives me a box of dog treats from behind the counter and says, "Call and tell me what happens." I drove back to the campsite and left the dog treats a few feet from the camper. It was pretty late, so I went to bed. In the morning, I looked outside, and the treats were gone. Box and all. It was still a little dark, but I went outside. Checked the tires first. They were fine. When I stood up and looked around, I was sure I could see something staring at me from the edge of the woods. It was bigger than a man, maybe 8 or 9 feet. And sure enough, a face like a dog or wolf. Those tracks must have been from that thing because the feet were huge. It then snarled and bared its teeth at me, and those teeth made me think of a dinosaur's teeth for sure. Yeah, those teeth could have done that to the tire. I definitely did not want to make that thing mad, so I slowly packed up and hooked up my trailer and got out of there. Didn't stop at the visitor center, although I thought about that Paul Bunyan guy the whole way out of there. I guess those locals really do know what's up. I should have known better than to doubt them. It has long been a dream of mine to visit Montana, and this past summer I finally crossed it off my bucket list and planned a week-long camping excursion in Kootenai National Forest. I do a lot of traveling and hiking solo. I only have a few friends and they aren't really interested in the outdoors. Kootenai National Park is one of the wildest places in Montana, far in the northwest part of the state, and butt up against the border with Canada. It was a little tricky to get to and involved 2 flights and a long car ride, but eventually I made it. I had a map of the park and a rough idea of where I wanted to visit and where I would make camp each night. It was like some of the more touristy places like Yellowstone and Zion. There's a lot more freedom to set camp where you want and basically just explore on your own. The first 2 days were great, coming from the city and being able to explore mountains and lakes without another soul in sight was a very liberating experience, and I was dreading going back to the concrete jungle in just a couple of days. But the 3rd night I started to experience, well, strange things. I was exhausted after a full day of hiking, and after cooking a freeze-dried dinner, I crawled into my tent just as the sun went down. My tent was thin, a single-person backpacking model, and offered no protection except for rain and bugs. Just as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard a heavy thud echo from somewhere deep in the forest. I immediately became alert. The noise continued slowly and monotonously, becoming louder and louder. It sounded like it had come right up to the edge of my camp, maybe 30 yards away. I had my rain fly up, couldn't see anything, and didn't dare to leave my tent. After about 10 minutes of silence, the noise began again, but this time heading away from my camp until fading away altogether. I stayed awake for hours until I just couldn't fight it anymore, and eventually passed out. When I awoke, the sun was already high in the sky, and I scrambled to eat breakfast and pack up. Before leaving, I decided to go and investigate the area where I had heard the noises last night. What I found set me hard on edge. Print in the hard earth, at least twice the size of a typical man. The prints were deep, whatever it was heavy, and it appeared to have 4 long curving claws on each foot. I decided it was a good idea to get far away from this spot. I spent a good deal of time outdoors and researching, and was fairly confident that whatever made these prints was something common to man. I hiked southeast for most of the day and settled on a spot near a tiny lake. I hadn't thought to bring any fishing tackle and didn't really have room anyway, so I just let the perfect view wash away the memories from last night. However, things were going to get so much worse. I was still a little wary and decided I would stay awake for a few extra minutes, just in case. Sure enough, about 20 minutes after sundown, I heard the slow pounding again. I rushed out of my tent and took position about 40 feet away behind some bushes. I didn't want to be trapped if that thing came into camp. The thunderous footfalls continued, getting closer and closer. I was quivering with terror and wished I had just kept running, but it was too late now. The thing was too close. It was right on the edge of my camp. The sight before me was more horrifying than I can put into words. It was immense, at least 13 or 14 feet tall. It walked on 2 crooked legs, and flayed skin covered the body with patches of bone showing through. Its rib cage was completely exposed, and its head looked like that of a deer's skull. A single antler spouted from the right side, the left looking to have been broken off at the stump. This time it did not hesitate. It moved purposely into the middle of my camp and went right for my tent. It took its 2 heavy claws and ripped the tent open, and then reached inside, fishing around for something. Me. After realizing I wasn't there, the creature let out a series of hoarse shrieks and whistles, like a wounded deer I had once heard. The sound filled the air and seemed to echo on long after they should have. I was too frozen with terror to even think about moving, and just watched as the beast tossed my tent and shredded the few other belongings I had left in the camp. Its call was answered by the same noise from somewhere far, far in the north. After destroying my camp, the creature lumbered off the way it had come, and the pounding of its heavy feet faded away. I laid still for hours, not able to work up the courage to move. Finally, just as the sun began to show itself, I moved into the camp. I was able to salvage my travel documents, but nothing else. The food had been shredded, and my tent was useless. I didn't want to waste any time and started off in the rough direction of where the park's headquarters was. A day later, exhausted and dehydrated, some I made it. I guess one of the rangers saw I was in severe trouble and set me up in a room to rest because I woke up the next day on a rough cot. A few scratches and cuts had been treated. I spoke with one of the rangers and thanked him for his help. I was able to heal up quickly and didn't need any serious treatment. I told the ranger about what had happened and what I had seen. When I described the creature, he got a very odd look on his face, surprise, but not disbelief. He told me it would be best if I kept this to myself. Very few people would believe me. And after thinking about it, I agreed. After digging around and watching some videos, it sounds like what I encountered was something called a wendigo. I don't know if that's what it was or something else. I just know that it stalked me for 2 days, and if I had been in my tent, well, I wouldn't be writing this. Maybe the wild places just need to stay wild. This story is so insane that the woman who shared it has asked to be referred to by the name of Michelle. She says that the encounter was so intense that she hasn't shared it with anyone, mainly because she doesn't want to take the chance of having to live with the stigma of being called crazy. The encounter starts with Michelle leaving her house on the morning of November 19th, 2003, for her daily run before work. It was early morning, and an unusually warm morning for November in Michigan, which can be cold, especially where she lived in East Lansing, in an apartment near Michigan State University. The sun had just started to peek over the horizon, which meant that the temps would now slowly start to creep upwards. At this time, the streets were still mostly deserted, with only a few cars driving by every now and then, which was exactly how Michelle liked it. Mornings like this were what kept her head clear and sane. She had a usual route that she ran, and her body could do it on autopilot. She ran along the road because it had a sidewalk and it felt safe. This particular day, she was deep in thought as her feet rhythmically hit the ground, thinking of a vacation she had coming with a group of girls, when all of a sudden she heard commotion in a grouping of bushes nearby. Now, ordinarily, a strange noise wouldn't have fazed her since she's always been more of a city girl, and she knew that it was usually best to ignore strange noises and just move away from them quickly. But this noise was different. It sounded large, like whatever was making the noise was big. Michelle quickly remembered the flyers she saw in her apartment building by the mailboxes for a neighbor's missing dog that had last been seen about 3 days ago. Her first thought was she wondered if it could be that dog. She knew she had to check. She would never forgive herself if she didn't. And so she quickly stopped and tried to peer behind the bushes, trying to see what had made the noise. As she leaned forward trying to get a better visual, suddenly out from the shadows stepped a very large wolf-like creature. It was easily as big as a full-grown man, and it was now standing completely upright, staring at her. Michelle stood there with her eyes as wide as saucers. She could see that it was about the size of a very large German shepherd standing on its long back legs, with a long neck, large furry head, and fur-covered arms that hung lower than seemed to be normal. But of course, nothing about this was normal. Its fur was light brown with some black mixed in. She remembers wishing she had a gun. She clearly felt danger emanating from the creature. It then began to slowly stalk towards her, and then it just stopped and stood there, staring at her for an amount of time that seemed like forever, and yet at the same time could have been seconds. And then the wind began to pick up, and the scent of the creature hit her. It was a rank, putrid smell that made her nauseous. Eventually, it turned around and walked away into the woods, leaving Michelle standing there completely dumbfounded, watching it as it melted back into the darkness from the direction it had come. Michelle remained frozen in place for a few moments after the creature had disappeared, and then she immediately abandoned the rest of her run and turned around to make her way back home, trying to make sense of what she had seen, but also trying not to think about it so that she could get herself home safely. The whole way back, she tried to tell herself that it was just a large dog, but she knew that wasn't the truth. It had been too big and too feral, too much like a werewolf. And then, before getting too far, she thought about turning around to try and see if she really had just experienced this unknown creature. But she pretty quickly realized that that was a really bad idea considering she was alone. It was so early in the morning and the rest of the neighborhood was likely still asleep. So, she abandoned that idea for now, but told herself that one day she would come back to try and find whatever it was that she had seen that morning. As she started off again, she could still smell the creature, and then, off in the distance, she thought she heard a howl that sounded almost human, and then additional howls that sounded like they were coming. She ran home as fast as she could, not wanting to be caught out in the open if that thing came back. When she got back inside her house, she quickly locked all of the doors and windows, making sure everything was secure. And then she called the police. It took a while for them to arrive, and by the time they did, the sun was up, and she could see their cruiser pull into her driveway. Michelle ran out to meet them and recounted her story to the officers, but they didn't seem too concerned. They told her they would head over to the area she mentioned and look around. They also promised to look into it and see if anyone else in the neighborhood had reported anything similar, but she never heard back from them, and she decided not to reach back out. She figured that they wouldn't find anything anyway. Because whatever she had seen that morning was long gone by now, she was sure of it. She was convinced that it was smart enough to know that it shouldn't been seen by the light of day. The whole incident left her feeling unsettled, and she began to feel like she was being watched. She was careful to lock her doors and windows every night, but still, every time she went outside, she felt like eyes were on her, judging her, waiting for her. And not only from the creature, but she felt self-conscious that people knew her story and were judging her when they saw her. The encounter was basically eating away at her self-confidence and even her sanity. But she never did see the creature again, and eventually she convinced herself that it had all just been a dream, a very vivid dream at that. Because the alternative, believing in it, was just too difficult. And even now, years later, she still sometimes hears that howl in her dreams, and she still lets the thoughts into her mind that it might have been real. I was staying with my grandma after she had an operation on her knee. To be honest, she probably should have been in assisted living, but she was always a pretty independent lady and wanted to stay that way for as long as possible. She could still take care of herself and was in her right mind most of the time. I say most of the time because sometimes she would randomly say things that made no sense, but then she would act completely normal the rest of the day. She was going to need a little help after her operation, so instead of getting a caretaker for her, I took some time off work and elected to stay over and help her out. I should note that my grandmother lived in an older house set deep in the woods of rural Georgia. Her father built the house, and she ended up with it after her parents died. None of her siblings wanted it, but she felt attached to it and lived there ever since. We used to visit in the summer months when school was out, but there were very strict rules. One of the rules you dared not break, was that no one was to leave the yard. We could play on the mowed grass, but as soon as the grass turned to weeds, we were not allowed past it, and we would get beat if we ever set foot in the forest. Back then, I thought Grandma was just worried we'd get lost in the woods, but as I would come to learn, it wasn't that at all. She wasn't worried about us getting lost. She was worried about us getting taken. You see, there's something that lives out there in those woods. Something evil. It's neither human, nor is it an animal. I don't think anyone quite knows what the creature is, but there have been sightings and stories of these things all over the world. People just don't like to talk about them. The locals learned to live with them. It was my first night there after Grandma had been released from the hospital. I had forgotten something in my car and went out to get it. It was around 8 p.m. and was getting dark. Grandma heard me open the front door and screamed for me to shut it. I told her that I was just going to my car, but she begged me to wait until morning. My car was only 30 feet from the door. I could see it out the window. I figured she was just on one of her weird tangents again, or maybe she was a little loopy from the painkillers. I told her that I would be fine and that I would be back in a minute. She stopped me before I went out the door and said, "Don't follow the lights. Don't follow the voices. It was weird, but that was normal for her. She would say weird things like that all the time. Things that made no sense, or things I thought made no sense. I assured her that I would only be gone for a minute and that everything was fine. And then I went out to my car. It was dark out, but I could see enough of the surrounding area by the porch light. I unlocked my car and the headlights turned on, lighting the driveway even more. I wasn't worried, not in the slightest. I was digging in the passenger side of my car, looking for whatever thing I had forgotten. I can't even remember what it was or why it was so important, but suddenly I had the feeling that I was being watched. I felt fine just a second ago, but now I feel odd. Like there was something wrong, but I didn't know what. Something told me to look up. It was like that feeling you get when you think someone is following you, so you suddenly turn around to look. That was the feeling I had. I looked up, and in the forest I saw what looked like lights. I counted 6 of them, tiny golden lights all in a row. I was focused on the lights in front of me, trying to figure out what they were when I had that feeling again. The feeling that I need to turn around and look at something behind me. So I did. And there were lights behind me too. Now another line of lights. I spun around and they were everywhere. I didn't know what to think. I had no idea what they could be. I heard my grandma banging on the window. She yelled at me to come inside. I saw the lights in the forest directly in the line of the headlights of my car. They weren't there a moment ago, but they were there now. I turned on the high beams to see if I could get a glimpse of what they were, and I was horrified. The golden lights, they were eyes, dozens and dozens of eyes. I couldn't get a good look at the creature, but I saw it well enough to never want to see it again. It looked almost human. It was ghoulish. It had pale skin, nearly gray in color. Its body was angular and bony. It had arms and legs like a human, but was sitting hunched over. I couldn't see its face very well, but I did see that its nose was just a hole in its head. It looked almost like a skull. I ran back inside the moment I realized what I was looking at. I was shaking when I slammed the door behind me. I could barely catch my breath. My grandma just said, "I told you not to go out there." I couldn't get much information out of her regarding the creatures. She told me never go out at night and never go into the forest, day or night. She also told me that they can mimic voices, and if I hear someone in the forest asking for help, don't follow them. I asked what they wanted from us, but she couldn't, or rather wouldn't, give me an answer. She just said that as long as I followed the rules, I wouldn't have to worry. I'm an amateur photographer and nature enthusiast, always on the lookout for new and exciting things to capture on camera. This particular adventure took place in the dense forests of the Appalachian Mountains, where I had heard rumors of strange and unexplained sightings. I was excited to explore the area, but little did I know that I was about to encounter something that would change my perspective on the unexplained forever. As an avid hiker and camper, I had always been drawn to the Appalachian Mountains. I had heard whispers of unusual sightings and stories of creatures that lurked in the woods, but I had never encountered anything that I couldn't explain. That was until my latest trip. It was a crisp autumn morning when I first caught sight of it. Unlike anything I had ever seen, a creature was perched on a nearby tree branch. It was about the size of a large dog, but its features were distinctly simian, with sharp claws and piercing eyes that seemed to bore into my soul. It looked like something out of a horror movie, and I was terrified. Despite my fear, my curiosity got the best of me, and I decided to investigate. I slowly approached the creature, camera in hand, trying to get a better look. But as I got closer, it suddenly leaped from the branch and disappeared into the dense underbrush. I was left alone, my heart racing, and unsure of what to do next. Over the next few days, I saw the creature several more times, always from a distance. It seemed to be watching me, almost studying me. I began to feel like I was being stalked by some wild animal, but this was no ordinary beast. It was intelligent and cunning and seemed to be almost human-like in its behavior. I confided in my spouse about what I had seen, but they were skeptical, chalking it up to my overactive imagination. That was until they saw the creature for themselves. We both knew that we had to figure out what was going on. As the days passed, the sightings became more frequent, and the creature became more brazen. It would come right up to our campsite, making eerie noises and awful screeches that echoed through the forest. We knew we had to get to the bottom of this before it was too late. Our fear and anxiety were at an all-time high. We didn't know what this creature was capable of or what it wanted from us. The constant fear of the unknown was starting to wear on us, and we knew that we had to find answers. One night, we were woken up by a loud scratching on the side of our tent. We could hear the creature snarling and growling just outside, and we knew that it was trying to get in. We were terrified, but luckily the creature eventually gave up and disappeared into the night. We knew we had to leave the area and seek help. We spent weeks researching and talking to locals, trying to uncover the truth behind the creature's identity. We finally came across an old legend that described a creature known as the devil monkey. We couldn't believe what we were reading, but it all made sense. According to our research, the devil monkey was a mischievous creature that liked to torment and scare humans. It was said to have razor-sharp claws and teeth, and it was known to be fiercely territorial. We learned that the devil monkey had been seen in the Appalachian mountains for generations, but sightings had become less frequent in recent years. Some believed that the creature was nothing more than a myth, but we knew that it was real. After our encounter with the devil monkey, we decided to leave the area and return home. We had accomplished our goal of uncovering the truth, and we knew that we had to share our experiences with others. We reported our findings to local authorities and animal experts, but it never seemed to catch on with anyone. The experience had been both terrifying and exhilarating, and it had changed us forever. We were now believers in the unexplained, and we knew that there was so much more out there waiting to be discovered. Our encounter with the devil monkey opened a new world of possibilities for us. We began to seek out other unexplained phenomena. We knew we had a unique perspective, and we were excited to share it with the world. Looking back on our encounter with the devil monkey, we realized how lucky we were to have survived. We had been in the presence of a wild and unpredictable creature, and we knew that we had to respect its power and intelligence. Our experience had shown us that there was so much more to the world than what we could see. We had been forced to confront our fears and doubts, and we had become stronger because of it. We knew that there were still many mysteries waiting to be uncovered, and we were excited to continue our journey of discovery. I was in my hometown outside of Albany, New York for Father's Day. It had been a very long time since my family had been all together at one time and in one place. My siblings and I had all scattered once we took jobs and got married. My dad was the main anchor of our family and unfortunately had been diagnosed with cancer that spring. So we all decided to have a big party for him for Father's Day. He didn't know we were all coming together for it, and it was intended to be a surprise. I was driving to the cabin because I didn't care for planes much. And at the time this happened, I wasn't living too far away. Just a state away in Scranton, Pennsylvania. My mom asked if I'd be okay to drive up to the cabin a few days in advance to set up the place. Get it cleaned and set up with party streamers and things. Since I lived the closest other than my mom and dad, I agreed to head up on Friday night. I had gotten into the state a little after 6 in the evening, but I needed to drive an hour or two more before I'd actually reach the cabin. I had stopped in a suburban area very close to where I grew up. I needed gas and a snack, but my mom said to be careful that someone we knew didn't see me, like these nosy neighbors we had. She didn't want the surprise to be ruined, so I raced inside, paid for everything, and left. When I got back on the road, I regretted my stop. It seemed to have made me more tired than I expected. I had been driving for hours and I was alone, so I was getting sleepy. But I knew I was almost there, which helped a little. and I was super excited to see everyone. I turned some music on and started trying to sing along so I wouldn't doze off. It was weird being back in town without seeing anyone. It felt like I was a ghost in a way, and I think it made that night more eerie. Feeling like you're a ghost in your own town. I really wanted to see my cousin, so she promised to meet me at the cabin the following day. Plus, who really wants to stay in a cabin by a lake all alone for 2 days? Not me. I hoped I had enough decorations. But my cousin said that if I didn't, they'd gladly bring some extra stuff that they had. I started to get towards the edge of town. I knew when I was going over the creek because of this strange bump and weird, uneven feeling of the bridge. The bridge didn't have a top or anything like that, so in the dark, unless you knew it was there, there wouldn't be any sign of it, except the sensation of you being bounced around in your car. There were lots of trees at this point and houses were becoming scarce, but I'd still see one every now and then. Road, and then I saw it again. This time I saw it more clearly. It was pale. It didn't appear to have hair. What I could see was simply a creature with pale skin. It was hanging off the trunk of the tree. It reminded me of a kind of chimp or monkey or something, probably because of its long fingers and toes. It all stood out so prominently from the trees because of its pale skin, so I could easily see that the fingers and toes seemed to wrap around the tree. Not completely, but enough to make it look like it was suctioned to the tree. And its eyes, they still glowed. But this time I knew it wasn't a cat. It was about the size of a small child, I'd say. I wish I could tell you about its face. I really couldn't see all that much. It was blocked by the tree's trunk, but it was sort of sticking out, like it was looking out towards me. I started to freak out. I wasn't sure if this thing was following me or what it was doing. I just knew I didn't feel comfortable. And I was well aware of the fact that I was all alone. I didn't want to stop the car. I raced through the trees and to the cabin. I didn't bother to focus on where my headlights were shining because I was so scared that I'd see the thing again. I didn't. When I pulled into the driveway of the cabin, I immediately grabbed my cell phone and dialed my mom's number. I told her what had happened. I was hysterical, and the experience ended up ruining my dad's surprise party because I just couldn't stand the thought of being there alone. So I left and headed home without decorating or getting ready for the party. Needless to say, my dad was happy to see me. The family did all convene for the party, but it was no longer a surprise, and there were no decorations set up in advance. We all had a great time, and there were no further sightings of that creature. Father's Day turned out good in the end, but I'll never go to that cabin again. Sometimes the old ways are the best ways. At least that's what my grandfather says. I guess you can be the judge of that. Anyway, I live in Pennsylvania now, but my family is from down south. Deep south. My grandmother was a school teacher and my grandfather was a cop. This was back in the day when they used prisoners as labor, so Grandpa did some time guarding chain gangs. Basically, prisoners were required to work to clean roadsides, road construction, dig ditches, that kind of thing. Grandpa was one of the sheriffs on guard duty, which meant he got to stand around in the hot sun, shotgun on his shoulder, and monitor the men. He was a hard case, but he was never one of those guards who tolerated people getting hurt, no matter what side of the badge they were on. He made sure the men got water and rest when they needed it, but mostly his job was to make sure no one went wandering and the work got done. This one story I want to tell you about happened back in the summer of 1958. The chain gang was called out to dig out some drainage ditches along the highway outside of Guntersville, which is southeast of Huntsville. It's a nice town right on the lake. Cleaning drainage ditches isn't easy, but it's necessary work. None of the convicts liked it. Hard labor in hot weather. Mosquitoes were the size of fishing boats, slogging in mucky water, digging out marsh plants that really didn't want to be dug out, and cleaning up trash. So, you can imagine there was plenty of complaining. My grandpa said most of the men just stuck to complaining under their breath because some of the guards weren't too keen on chit-chat. Grandpa mostly kept to himself and did his patrol, walking up and down the convict line along where they worked alongside the road. I said before that Grandpa had a dog with him. He was a German shepherd named Arizona, and he took his job about as seriously as Grandpa did. He was all business when they walked the line. So when the dog was alerted, you know how their head goes up and their ears go straight. My grandfather took note. So one of the convicts started slapping at the water where he was standing. It was waist deep, thick with tall weeds and dark brown with all the mud they were kicking up. Couldn't see a thing. But he was yelling loud and clear that there was something in the water biting at him. Now, a drainage ditch isn't Lake Guntersville, but it's still water, so it's not a shock that something besides the men might be in it. My grandfather would have been more inclined to tell him to just pipe down, except for how Arizona was reacting. Grandpa called for the nearest corrections officer to help him, and they pulled the man up out of the water. Now, you can't pull someone on a chain gang very far without pulling the rest of them, but they did get him out enough to see what the fuss was, and sure enough, his jumpsuit was shredded. When they rolled up the pant legs, they could see welts, dozens of them, as if something had bitten him. Well, Grandpa tells it like they assumed it was leeches, because that's a thing. But while they were figuring out what to do, another one of the convicts started jumping up and down, yelling. Now, there's always a risk that the men on the chain gang were trying to pull one over on the guards so they could escape. But Grandpa looked over at his dog again, and Arizona was staring at the water in the ditch and whining. He gave the order to pull all the men out of that ditch. That didn't sit right with a few of the other guards, but Grandpa was firm. It helped that the other dog on site was acting the same way, staring at the water and whining, ears flat like they were scared. When they pulled the line up, the other prisoner who'd been shouting also had torn clothes. But there was something else there. The way Grandpa tells the story is that his legs were covered in little white things. Grandpa said they looked like leeches, if leeches had arms and legs. I remember that I actually interrupted the story to ask if he was sure. I asked what they looked like, and he said in a very hushed voice, they had spindly little arms like tiny, skinny tree branches, but they ended in even tinier three-fingered hands and feet, and those things dug into that poor man's skin like the worst burr you ever saw. The prisoner started yelling something awful as soon as he saw those things. I don't even know what to call them. He tried to run, and of course, since they were all chained together, this yanked the closest prisoners onto the ground with him. Half the chain gang was standing as far away as the chains would allow, and the other half, the ones closest to the lakeside of the road, were all down in the dirt in the weeds alongside the road. The guards tried to pull the creatures off his legs, but they were rubbery and hard to get hold of. Or maybe it was because they were so slimy and disgusting that no one really wanted to touch them. Even the dogs were whining and backing up, acting like scared puppies rather than the working dogs they were. They could have just dragged the entire prisoner line into the bus and brought everyone back to the jail for the infirmary to take care of it, but these things were uncanny. There was just something about them. Grandpa said the sheriff tried to yank off the biggest leech creature, but the thing just clung tighter. Blood was running down the con's leg as he wailed. One of the guards suggested cutting the head off, like a lamprey. Did that work? I asked. From the look on my grandfather's face, I already knew the answer. We cut it at the neck, took the body clean off, but the head, it stayed. I could see it burrow deeper into the muscle. I don't mind telling you I was feeling pretty grossed out by this story, but I was also invested. I needed to see where this went. So, what happened? I asked. We burned them, he said. Apparently one of the other officers got the notion to grab the cigarette lighter out of the police cruiser so they could try to burn them off. Grandpa told me that they shoved the hot metal against the back of the biggest leech's head, and it worked. The leech popped off with its mouth open, like it was screaming. It had a head like a lamprey, all teeth and blood, with tiny black eyes and no nose. Once it was loose, Grandpa grabbed, threw it on the ground, and used his heavy boot on it. The sheriff told him to keep doing that while the rest of them unchained the prisoners who hadn't gotten anything on them to lead them back to the bus. Grandpa was stuck with the disgusting duty of removing whatever those things were, and that's when he got an idea. He ran back to the cruiser and pulled out a half-empty box of shotgun shells, dumped the shells in his pocket, and ran back to the prisoner. When they pulled off the next leech thing, he killed it but stuck the body in the box and ran that back to the car, where he locked it in the glove box. When he got back, the other officers were pulling off the last of the things. They'd just gotten to the last few when the dogs went on alert. Grandpa trusted Arizona more than anything, so when his dog looked out at the lake beyond the drainage ditch, he looked too. Couldn't see anything though, so he went back to burning off the critters. But Arizona was agitated, pacing at the edge of the ditch, so Grandpa looked again. There was something in the water, under the water. He could see the ripple of something moving. It looked big, and it looked like it was heading their way, fast. Grandpa shouted to get away from the ditch, and that was when the other dogs started whining, then growling, then going to full-on barking. The prisoners did what they could to scramble out of range of the water, but even if they weren't chained on a line, their ankles were still chained together, and that limited how fast they could move. I point that out because the next thing Grandpa told me was how the water at the shoreline of the lake where it met the drainage ditch exploded. He said it just went up like God had turned on a fountain, but what came out of it was nothing the Lord ever made. At first he thought it was a gator. Not that they had them in those parts, but it could have been that one came up the river from the bayous and stayed. But gators don't stand up. This thing did. It had a hide like a gator, all scaled and green and slick, like armor, with a gator's underbelly too, but it had arms and shoulders like a man. But the worst part, the absolute worst part, was the head. Teeth like a lamprey and an open gash of a mouth, black eyes, no nose. And it screamed. My grandfather was a big tough guy, even when he was old, and he still turned white when he told me how it sounded. Like a shriek straight from hell. It moved before anybody else could do anything besides whispering prayers to the Almighty and went for the closest convict. It was the other man with bites on his legs, but none of the leech critters. Arizona and the other dog went for it, latching onto its arm and a leg like they were trained to do. The prisoner was screaming because the thing had its claws in him. Grandpa said you could smell the blood over the stink of the ditch water. He unholstered his shotgun and fired dead center. He knew he hit it because the thing staggered and screamed again. Staggered, yes, but it didn't stop. It ripped that poor convict's leg clear to the bone. By this time, most of the other officers were calling off the dogs and unloading on it. It went back into the water, leaving a dying man and a bunch of prisoners, and cops who had no idea what had just happened. If you're wondering what happened after that, I can tell you what Grandpa said. They tried to save the mauled man, but he didn't make it. He died on the scene. The rest of the chain gang got brought back to the penitentiary. Now you have to remember that this was in the 50s, and there were two things on everyone's mind. So when they got back to the jail, the sheriff called up the FBI to tell them they had a report. Either it was a red menace or it was an alien, but either way, it wasn't a local jurisdiction thing. My grandpa used to joke that the feds were always a day late and $1 short on the best days, but pretty soon, men in suits were at the jail, taking testimony and grilling everyone like a cheap steak. The body of the convict was confiscated. Evidence, they said. The witnesses were all ordered not to talk, and then the feds disappeared. A public service announcement went out later that night, warning people to stay away from the lake. Rogue gator. A man-eater. I asked my grandpa why he was telling me this now if he'd been warned not to talk about it, and he laughed. Who'd believe me? That was when I remembered that he'd put the body of one of those leech things in his car. Didn't he have that? But my grandfather shook his head and told me that he'd had the same thought after the feds left, but when he got back to his cruiser, the ammo box was gone. No proof. No story. And the feds must have done something about whatever was in the lake, because only one fisherman went missing after that. A crazy story from a confused old man. Or the truth. All I know is I never go near that section of Lake Guntersville just to be on the safe side. I was driving a logging truck on a project in northeastern British Columbia. It was an extremely remote area. If I'm honest, it was a little creepy if you had to drive the logging road at night. It felt like driving through a tunnel of trees, like the trees were going to reach out and grab you. It took a while to get used to it. The native stories about the area didn't help. I knew some First Nation guys who wouldn't set foot in those forests, but I was never one to believe stuff like that. The biggest problem I had was the deer. That's what I was afraid of. The forest was so dense that you couldn't see them standing in the shadows at the edge of the road. We had elk and moose up there too, but they seemed to keep off the road for the most part. The deer, on the other hand, would jump out right at your truck. I knew there were other animals out there in the woods, like bears and wolves. Animals you definitely didn't want to run into. Animals that were dangerous. But there's something else that lives out there with them. Something only found in the very far north of Canada. The local First Nations tribe called it a medicine bear. It was said to have sacred spiritual powers, and seeing one was extremely rare, and either very lucky or unlucky depending on who you talked to. I heard other stories calling it a ghost, a spirit from an ancient past, some poor creature that was long dead and lost in time. They said it couldn't be killed. People have claimed to shoot it, only to have the bullet pass straight through, as if the animal itself wasn't real. The creature would just look at them without even a flinch. I never heard any stories of it attacking someone, but there was always a hint of danger to the tales. A few people were convinced it was some prehistoric creature that somehow survived undetected in the remote north of Canada. And after working up there for a while, I wouldn't be at all surprised that an ancient species managed to stay hidden for thousands of years. The forests are so remote they are barely accessible to humans. Just beyond the area we were logging was a huge national park reserve that was only reachable by bush plane. There were very few people around, if any. After seeing the creature myself, I know what my theory is, but I'll let you decide for yourself. I was driving back along the logging road. It had taken a bit longer to load the trailer than I had planned for, so I was stuck driving the road at night. The headlights illuminated the way directly in front of me, but I felt engulfed in darkness. I don't know why, but the night always felt darker out here. Maybe it was the lack of light pollution or the cover of the trees surrounding the road. It was unsettling to say the least. I was always looking out for deer, and that night one of my worst fears came true. I never saw them at the edge of the road. It was just too dark. 2 of the deer made it across the road, but I plowed right into the third. Luckily, it wasn't a big enough impact to cause me to lose control. I stopped the truck as soon as I was able to investigate the damage. I cursed the deer for being so stupid. There was no way they didn't hear my truck or see the headlights. But of course, they had to run out right in front of me. But then I heard something moving through the forest behind me. It was quiet, but there was definitely something out there. And then I realized that the 3 deer that ran out in front of me weren't being suicidal at all. They were being chased. I saw it walk out into the road. I shined my flashlight at it. It looked at me briefly, acknowledging my existence, but it didn't seem to care. It was focused on the deer that lay dead in the ditch. Now, I'm not exaggerating when I say this thing was the size of a horse. It was bigger than any bear I had ever seen. Its fur was solid white and shaggy. It had the head of what looked like a wolf, but it was more blocky and its muzzle was wider, like some sort of cross between a wolf and a bear. It walked on its toes like a wolf did, but its shoulders were significantly higher than its hips. There was an angle to its hind legs that was dog-like. Think of a hyena, and that's kind of what it moved like. I could see how people mistook it for both a wolf and a bear, but it was actually something in the middle. The creature had no interest in me at all. Its only focus was the dead deer. It walked across the road and into the ditch and began tearing open the deer. I watched it for a moment, having a hard time believing what I was seeing in front of me. This was definitely the animal from the stories, but what exactly was it? I had no idea. I don't think it was a ghostly spirit. Or why would it need to eat? I don't think it was some sort of evil monster either. It didn't try to attack me. It acted like a wild animal looking for an easy meal. I don't know how our encounter would have gone if the dead deer wasn't in the ditch. But then again, the incident with the deer was the entire reason I was standing there outside my truck in the first place. I didn't tell anyone what I saw up there. There were a few guys I worked with that would have taken the opportunity to hunt the beast, hoping to capture some sort of mythical trophy just for the sake of killing. Did the creature look dangerous? Oh yes, but I didn't think it wanted much to do with humans. I was standing outside next to it with only a flashlight, and it didn't try to attack me, even though I was near its food. So I decided to keep it a secret. I won't disclose the exact area I saw it, but it was very far north. So far north that something like that could remain hidden for a very long time. I was doing some field work near the Centennial Valley. I was in college at the time, going for a degree in conservation. I found a summer job testing water quality in various areas across the valley. Some days were easy, some were hard. It all depended on the location of the samples I needed to collect. Centennial Valley is big on conservation. It lies just west of Yellowstone and is a massive migration field for local wildlife. The valley itself is made up of mostly grasslands and wetlands, but it is surrounded by mountains on both sides. The lower part of the mountains are covered in thick forests. It's some rough country out there. Beautiful, but very dangerous if you don't know your way around. We were required to make notes of any animal encounters we had while working in the field. There was an ongoing study of the wildlife populations in the valley, so they wanted everyone working out there to record what they could. We didn't have to note birds or marmots, just the big things like deer, elk, bison, bears, moose, and wolves. I didn't have a whole lot of animal encounters that summer. I saw a few elk early in the year and a brown dot off in the distance that looked like a grizzly bear, but I wasn't close enough to be certain. I was extra cautious about bears in the area, and moose. I was terrified of running into a moose. I was naive to think bears and moose were the most dangerous things in the valley. There's something else living out there that didn't make it into my field notes. I didn't think anyone would believe me, so I've kept quiet about it until now. It was towards the end of the season. I was collecting water samples from a river that ran through the valley. It was an area only accessible by an ATV. This particular river was a main water source for several species of wildlife in the nearby area, so animal sightings weren't uncommon. As soon as I reached the river, I smelled something rotten. I knew right away that it was a carcass of some kind, but I couldn't see it right away. They made all of us take a bear safety course before we began working in the valley. Part of that course told us to stay very far away from any animal carcasses in case a bear was guarding the area. I didn't bother with the water samples. I started to turn the ATV around when I saw the carcass. It was an elk. Its antlers were peeking out of the tall grass. I had to drive right past it to get the ATV turned around. It was strange. Its body looked fresh, but it smelled like it had been dead for weeks. There weren't any wounds that I could see on the animal. It was skinny, but other than that, its body looked fine. Usually bears rip into the lower abdomen first. There are less bones there, but this animal was intact. And then I saw its head. All of the skin had been removed. It was only a skull, but it was still attached to the body of the elk. I didn't know what to think of it, but I knew I had to get out of there. I reported the carcass to the lead ranger overseeing my project, and the area was closed for a couple of weeks. This was to keep us safe from any potential bear encounters. But like I said, That wasn't the real danger out there. 2 days later, I was sent to a different location. This area was a marshy wetland. It was about 35 miles away from where I had found the elk carcass. I hiked to the edge of where the marshy area began to get my water samples when I was overcome by the smell of something dead. What were the odds that I stumbled upon 2 animal carcasses in less than a week? I slowly backed away from the edge of the water, scanning for any signs of predators in the area. I didn't see anything, nor did I see any tracks on the way in. I had about 50 yards to hike back to the ATV, and it felt like the longest 50 yards of my life. I had a can of bear spray with me, but I knew that wouldn't stop a bear if it was defending a meal. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw elk antlers in the grass. It was the same thing I had seen 2 days prior. A dead elk with no visible wound, no signs of predation, except for the skull. All of the skin had been removed from the skull. If I didn't know better, I would say it was the exact same animal I had seen before, but that was impossible. Both animals were dead and separated by a good 35 miles. I finally reached the ATV and got out of there as quickly as was safe. It was an odd experience, but I pushed it to the back of my mind. It bothered me, but I tried not to think about it. What was out there skinning the heads of these elk and leaving their bodies intact? And why haven't any predators found them? I would get my answer about a week later. I was sent out to a river on the far side of the valley. It was the same story. As soon as I got there, I smelled that rotting smell, and I just knew. I don't know how, but I knew. I knew it wasn't 2 dead elk that I found. This was some sort of creature, and it was following me. Like an idiot, I yelled out to it. I told it I knew it was out there, and I knew it wasn't dead, even though it had been pretending to be. And then I heard something rustling in grasses behind me. It was the creature. It had been lying down, no doubt pretending again to be dead. I couldn't see any eyes in the black holes of its skull, but I still knew it was looking right at me. It was the most horrifying thing I had ever seen. Its body was that of an emaciated elk, but it had no skin on its head. It somehow looked both alive and dead at the same time. Its legs were spindly, and the way it moved was odd. It was like the creature was about to collapse with every step, but I knew if it reached me, it could probably kill me. It looked at me, lowered its head, and blew air out of its exposed nasal passages. I bolted to the ATV and spun it around as fast as I could. That thing had been following me. I knew that much. I don't know what its plans were, but I knew they weren't anything good, and I didn't intend to stay and find out. The creature didn't follow me out that I could see. I stopped doing field work that day, and I never saw anything like it ever again. I have nightmares about it sometimes, about what it wanted to do to me, and why it didn't kill me when I first discovered it playing dead in the grass. I took a long enough look at it that it could have jumped up and reached me without a problem. I don't suppose I'll ever get answers to any of those questions. It's probably better that way. This encounter takes place in Trego County, Kansas in the summer of 1999. I'm going to leave my name out of this, but here's my story. I was born and raised near Trego County, Kansas. It's a small town with a population of just a few thousand people, but it's home to me. I grew up on a farm experiencing all the ups and downs that come with country living, but I loved it. I still do. We are a family of 6, and I am the oldest daughter with 3 younger brothers. My family all loved the smell of the dirt in the air, and I loved spending long hours outside playing with my brothers. We would chase each other around the fields or play games of tag in the barn. Mom and Dad always tried to give us a good life, and they worked hard to provide for us. We were never wealthy, but we were always happy, and we knew the value of hard work. I went to school right here in Trego County, and then I went off to college. I was the first in my family to do so, but I was headstrong and wanted to learn about marketing and other ways that I wanted to try and help the farm. I always knew that I wanted to come back home, though, too. And so, after I graduated, I moved back to the farm and lived there helping my mom and dad while also working down the road at Shiloh Vineyard and Winery. So anyway, back during the summer that this encounter happened in 1999, one of my favorite ways to spend my weekends was at Cedar Bluff State Park. It's just a short drive from the farm, only about 20 minutes, and it's the perfect place to get away from it all. The park is surrounded by beautiful forests, and there's a river running through it with a huge reservoir lake. It's the perfect place to go fishing, or to just relax and take in the scenery. I always feel so refreshed after spending a long day at the park because it's a great escape from the bustle and chores of everyday life. Anyway, I was starting to feel a little bit stagnant at work. I loved my job, but I was starting to feel like I needed a change. I was also feeling a lot of stress from work. My boss was always putting a lot of pressure on me because they were short-staffed at the time, and I was starting to feel like I couldn't handle it all. It even got to the point where I started to dread going into work, and I was constantly feeling anxious. So I went hiking at Cedar Bluff State Park, where I knew I would be able to clear my head. The park is the perfect place for that. It's quiet and peaceful, and it's a great escape from the hustle and bustle of everyday life. So I was hiking along my favorite trail when I saw something moving in the bushes up ahead. It caught my eye because it wasn't the normal kind of movement that I'm used to seeing while hiking. At first I thought it might be a deer, but then I realized that it was way too big to just be a deer. The bushes were moving in such a way that I knew the thing had to be huge. I started thinking and trying to figure out what it could be, but no good answers came to mind. So I slowly approached the bushes as they moved back and forth, and when I got close, that's when everything went quiet. I couldn't hear the birds anymore, and the only sound was the sound of my heart beating. I slowly parted the bushes, and that's when I saw it, and everything clicked into slow motion. Its fur was matted and black, and it was staring at me with these cold, dead eyes. I couldn't move, and I couldn't speak. I was paralyzed by fear looking into the blackness of this creature. The creature slowly started to step towards me, and I could feel the fear coursing through my veins. I honestly felt that this could be it, the day I was going to die. I watched as the thing approached. The creature was so tall, I couldn't even see its head as the sun threw its body into a silhouette. I knew it was staring down at me, though, and I felt small, weak, and insignificant in comparison. I didn't know what it was. I could only make out the outline, but it definitely wasn't anything I had ever seen before. If I had been able to think at the time, I would have felt like I was in a horror movie. The poor girl that gets attacked by a creature on a deserted trail. One thing I can say, though, is that the creature had wolf or dog-like characteristics, with a long snout and sharp teeth. It seemed to be studying me, as if it was trying to figure out what I was while it loomed over me. I didn't know what to make of it, but I was definitely scared. I also can say that I remember its smell. It smelled strange, like something I had never smelled before, but familiar all at the same time. It was musty and earthy, but not in a pleasant way, and it made my skin crawl. I can't say for sure how long we were in that position, me huddled to the ground and this beast looming over me, when suddenly I heard the sound of branches snapping about 20 or 30 feet away. I'm sure the creature must have heard the noise too, because it turned its head, and then it ran away into the woods towards the noise. I was shaking, and I could barely breathe. I had never been so scared in my life as I watched it disappear into the trees, moving quickly as if it had been activated by hearing the noise that we both heard, moving quickly like in a hunting kind of a way. And even though I was scared, I also couldn't help but be curious about what it was, wondering what it was exactly what it was doing in the woods, and why it was so curious about and interested in me. I didn't know how to qualify it all in my head. Well, you won't be surprised to hear that right then and there, I decided to leave the park and go home. I was so shaken up, but I managed to get myself out of the park and back to my car and back onto the highway. I couldn't stop thinking about that creature, though, and I'm pretty sure it was following me as I left, not in a way that it wanted me to see it, but in a way that it was curious, but didn't want to be seen. I say this because I feel like I'd catch a glimpse of movement in the woods along the exit road as I left. It wasn't until I got home that everything seemed to come back to me, and I could finally take a breath. but for the rest of the day, and even weeks later, I felt like that creature had somehow changed me and changed my perspective on life and what's important. I told my parents about the creature, and of course they were skeptical. But I was adamant about what I had seen, and eventually they started to believe me. They even helped me look up information about the creature online, and we found out that it was a kind of creature that has been reported in all other parts of the world. Even the descriptions we read online match what I experienced. Ever since that day, I've been back to the woods several times, but never alone. I always took a friend, or one of my brothers, with me. Always in the daylight and never at dusk or dark, hoping to catch a glimpse of the creature again. But I never have. Despite the fear I experienced, I've come to be enchanted by it in a way. I like to think that it's still out there somewhere, living its life in the woods, undisturbed by humans. Maybe one day I'll see it again, but for now I'm content with just knowing that it exists. My girlfriend and I live in an older duplex in a residential area of Connecticut. The surrounding homes are all older, and there's an old mill that's been turned into loft apartments right down the street. Basically, we're surrounded by history, and the architecture is beautiful. We got lucky with our apartment. It's in an older brick building with 12-foot-high ceilings and a lot of character. We live on the first floor. That'll be important later on. About 8 months into living here, Sarah and I were prepping for Halloween. Both of us grew up in big families and have a handful of nieces and nephews, so we get really excited for this holiday and go all out. Pumpkins, a lot of candy, and a scary soundtrack playing. We were finishing up a TV show at around 6 that night, and it was just starting to get dark, so we decided to turn the porch light on and hang out in the kitchen area. Now, to get into our apartment, you have to walk up a small porch, open the front door, which is always unlocked, and enter into a small foyer. To the left is a staircase that goes up to our neighbor's apartment. Our door is immediately across from the front door, about 4 or 5 feet. Right next to the stairs on the left is another door that goes down to the basement. Sarah and I checked out the basement when we first moved in, as it was offered as storage space, and it's huge. It was well kept, but definitely old with a lot of nooks and crannies. There are probably at least 4 separate lights down there, and like the rest of the building, it's all brick. The basement door has a latch on it, one of those complicated ones that slides and then fits into a notch. We always keep it locked unless the landlady gives us a heads up that a technician is coming. So on Halloween night, we were having a beer and chatting in the kitchen when we heard the front door into the foyer open. That was a little weird since our neighbors were all home upstairs and trick-or-treaters usually knock. I walked over and looked through the peephole to see if a trick-or-treater had invited themselves in. But no one was in the hallway. Thinking it might just be a draft, we went back to chatting and hanging out, keeping an eye out for families walking by. Eventually we heard a group out on the porch and stepped out of the apartment to the front door. But as we did so, we noticed the basement door was open. Not much, just an inch or two. But that was weird. It hadn't been opened when I'd looked out the peephole only a few minutes ago. Sarah shut it and we handed out candy, chatting with the kids' parents for a little bit before they went on their way. I gave the basement door another glance as we went back into the apartment but didn't say anything. A few more groups came and went, and then we had a bit of a lull. At around 7:30, we decided to take the dog out for a quick walk and locked up. It takes about 20 minutes to walk around the cul-de-sac, and we stopped to chat with other neighbors, so we got back at around 8. When we walked into the hallway, the basement door was open again. I asked Sarah if he'd locked it, and he said he did. He texted one of the upstairs neighbors asking if they'd gone down there. We got a pretty quick answer that no, they hadn't left their apartment at all. The neighbor, Andy, made a joke that maybe it was a ghost, but then quickly said it was probably just trick-or-treaters being weird. We tried to brush it off and had 2 more groups of kids come by before we turned off the porch light and packed it in for bed. Sarah was being a little weird and wanted to check the basement door again. I scoffed but was nervous, and when she looked through the peephole, the basement door was completely open. It was actually open so wide that it was blocking our door and Sarah couldn't see into the hallway. Both of us on edge, we opened our door. I had a heavy flashlight in hand just in case, and decided we had to go down to make sure no one was in the basement. We live in a safe area, but we're thinking maybe someone just randomly came into the apartment. That would be really weird, but the door isn't actually locked, just latched. Sarah and I went down and very, very slowly and checked the basement. We turned on every light and shone the flashlight in corners, but it was empty. When we got back up, I latched the door myself and jiggled it to make sure it was closed tightly. This time, Sarah texted our neighbor Andy to give him another heads up that the door had been open. Since it was Halloween, I tried to shrug it off as just a weird night, with teens messing around or something, and eventually got to sleep. Sarah had to wake up early the next morning to go to work. She came back into the bedroom and woke me up to show me that the basement door was open again. Someone had opened it in the night, sometime after 11 in the evening, when we went to bed. He locked it hurriedly, and I agreed to reach out to our landlady. She was concerned, but could only offer to put an actual lock on the door. She's supposed to be coming later this week to do so. Since Halloween, every single night the basement door gets opened, no matter how tightly we latch it or what we put in front of it. Sarah actually put a chair up against the handle one night and it was still open the next morning. We have no idea what's going on, but maybe our neighbor is right, and it actually is a ghost. Like I said, we live in a historic neighborhood. We've checked several times and haven't seen or heard a person going down there, but there's no way for the latch to just come undone by itself. Growing up, I always thought my grandparents were a little strange. When I was in grade school, I would spend the summers with them at their home in rural Georgia. But my grandpa passed when I was 11, so my memories of him are sparse, but I do remember him always reminding me to never ever whistle when I went into the forest. Every time I went outside, he would tell me this. Country folks around those parts can be superstitious for no apparent reason, so I never gave it much thought. It wouldn't be until many years later when I finally figured out what he was warning me about. I took a job with the Forest Service during the summer of 2007. We were clearing some wooded areas for a couple of new roads for more public access onto state lands. They were forest roads, so they didn't need to be perfect, but it was hard work regardless. We had trailers on site to stay in during the project if we wanted. About half the crew lived in the trailers that summer, me included. Strange things happened around the job site all summer. Nothing terrible. No one was hurt, but it was just odd. Things would move at night. We would hear strange sounds after dark. Some of the guys said they had odd dreams, but the weirdest thing that would happen was the voices. We would hear voices calling out to us from the forest at night, telling us to come outside. And if that wasn't strange enough, the voices we heard were those of people we knew, often our co-workers. At first, we thought it was just an elaborate set of pranks that no one would fess up to. We all had different ideas of who was behind it, and none of us agreed. After about 6 weeks of this happening every night, we were fed up. Tempers were high, and work had become miserable. And then, one night after work, when I was sitting outside my trailer with a couple of my co-workers, I heard a voice calling from the forest. This had become a regular occurrence around here, but this time, the voice calling from the forest was mine. My co-workers both looked at me. We had all heard the voice, and its source was definitely not me. Either one of our crew was a damn good mimic, or there was something else going on around here. I got up and walked to the edge of the tree line. I couldn't see anything out there at all. My co-workers tried to get me to come back to the trailer, but I had to know what it was. Some part of me hoped it was just another one of our co-workers being stupid, but deep in my gut, I knew better. I went maybe 15 feet into the forest before I had to turn back. It could have been intuition, or it could have just been my own fear. For whatever reason, I wanted to get out of there. I backed out of the forest, not wanting to turn my back on whatever was out there. I turned around when I got to the clearing and headed back towards the trailer. My co-workers were both standing in the doorway. And then we heard the voice again. My voice. I had enough of this. I went to the other trailers and checked on the rest of the crew. No one was missing, which meant none of us could have been in the forest. I could tell the rest of the crew was freaked out. They heard the voice too and watched me go into the woods looking for it. We were finally all in agreement that this was no friendly prank. There was something going on here and it felt like something bad. Not a single one of us had any ideas on what it could be, and without knowing what we were dealing with, there wasn't a whole lot we could do. I know it sounds stupid, but we decided to just lock ourselves in our trailers and go to bed. There were 2 or 3 people per trailer, so at least none of us were alone. We bolted the front door shut and all tried to pretend we weren't afraid. I could tell the other guys wanted to talk about it, but none of us had any ideas, so we just didn't. Night was beginning to fall, but no one would be sleeping well that night. I'd almost forgotten about my grandfather and his warnings. It was such a distant memory, but then, out of nowhere, I heard a whistle. It was definitely coming from outside. I opened the window and listened for it again. It was coming from the forest. I knew I should have listened to my grandfather, but I couldn't stand it. I had to know what was out there, and when I heard it whistle, I knew I could call it out. I waited a moment weighing my decision before I whistled back. Not 5 seconds passed before I got a response. I whistled again. It whistled back to me. The sound of the whistling began to grow closer and closer to the trailer until the creature finally came into view. At first I thought it was a ghost. It looked almost human but deathly pale. It had no hair on its head or anywhere else on its body that I could see. It had arms and legs that seemed human, but it crawled on the ground almost like a monkey. I couldn't see its eyes. They were just black circles against its pale face. The best way I can describe it is if a human skeleton had white skin stretched across it. That's what this thing looked like. We all watched it emerge from the forest. It saw us right away through the open window and began approaching the trailer. I couldn't tell from the expression on its face if it was malicious or curious. One of my coworkers grabbed the flare gun from beneath the couch and took a shot at the creature and hit it dead in the chest. Whatever that thing was, it retreated back into the forest, and we didn't have any problems with it again during the remainder of the summer. I wish I could go back in time and ask my grandpa what it was. He knew about those things out there in the forest. He knew they would come after you if you called them. I should have known something was wrong from the smell. It was rancid, like death 1,000 times over. If you've ever smelled a dead body, amplify it times 1,000 and you'll get an idea. I was ice fishing on a lake in rural Wisconsin, tucked away in my little heated ice shack. It had been a relatively uneventful morning, not much activity below the ice. Around noon, I broke into my lunchbox and pulled out a sandwich, but before I could take a bite, I was hit with that awful smell. I searched the contents of my lunch, but everything in there looked just fine. The interior of the ice shack did smell a bit like fish, I'll admit, but it wasn't anything like that. This smell just showed up suddenly and completely without explanation. It was so strong, I was doing everything I could to keep from gagging. It took me a moment to realize the source of the smell was actually coming from outside my shack. I bolted for the door to get some fresh air, only to realize the situation was worse out there. I saw a couple of other people standing outside their ice houses too, probably experiencing the same phenomenon I was. I yelled across the lake, asking them if they too were out there because of the smell. One of the people pointed at something in the distance. I immediately turned around to look, and was in total shock at what I saw. It was an elk, pure white and completely emaciated. Even from that distance, I could almost count its rib bones. Its fur was as white as the snow, but long and stringy, similar to that of a wet dog. I could see large swaths of red under its neck and across its side. I assumed it was blood from an injury, and it looked like a pretty bad injury at that. Despite what looked like heavy bleeding, The elk walked across the ice without problem. Its legs were long and spindly, but I didn't think that was atypical for an elk. To be honest, I had never seen an elk before. They are extremely rare in this area. We all stood outside our shacks, staring at this elk that appeared to be walking right to us. As the elk approached, the stench got even stronger. It was hard to imagine that smell could be coming from something living, but as the elk came into clearer view, I finally understood why. This was no normal living animal, at least not in the way that we know animals to be. It was clearly alive somehow, but there was more to it. Its whole body was rotten. As it got closer, I could see pieces of its flesh exposed and just hanging from its bones. It was the most disturbing thing I had ever seen in my life. The red in its fur appeared to be a mix of old and new blood. There were areas that were clearly clotted and matted into the hair, while the wounds continued to drip bright red. And if you thought that was bad, it gets worse. The elk's head, well, it didn't have any skin on it. It took me a moment to realize what I was looking at, since the creature had white fur. But its head, it looked like the skin of its face had been peeled back and was hanging down around its neck. The hide there was dried up, but still had the fur on it. All the muscles had been peeled away, leaving just the skull and antlers. I couldn't see its eyes, just two empty black sockets. Same for its nose. It looked like a walking corpse, and it smelled like one too. But here was this thing walking straight towards us like it hadn't a care in the world. And then, all of a sudden, it fell through the ice. I don't know how or why. The ice was at least 12 inches thick. There were trucks parked out here. There was no way that thing weighed enough to break through the ice, but it did, and it didn't resurface. As soon as the beast fell into the water, the smell disappeared. I went over to talk to the other fishermen, and they were just as dumbfounded as I was. We all ended up contacting the closest DNR office about the whole ordeal. I felt like a crazy person explaining this story to them, and I wasn't sure if they even believed me. When I went back the following day to retrieve my ice shack, there was yellow caution tape up around the boat launch. I'd say there were at least 7, maybe 8 emergency vehicles there. They let me get my shack off the ice, but said the lake would be closed to the public for the rest of the season. They wouldn't say why, but I knew it had something to do with that elk that fell through the ice. It bothered me for quite some time. I knew there was something more to this story. They knew something, but they weren't about to give out any information. The lake remained closed into the summer. That's when I heard a rumor from someone who lived near the lake. I didn't hear the story firsthand, so I can't say what did or did not happen beyond what I saw myself. But the rumor was that the DNR dredged the lake when the ice melted in the spring, and they found the body of that big old elk. They hooked onto its antlers and pulled it up on shore. There was a truck and trailer there waiting for it, but before they could load the elk's body onto the trailer, it disappeared. Like it got up and walked away after being trapped under the ice for months. Like I said, I can't confirm the end of the story, but none of it surprised me. That thing looked dead when I saw it walking out on the ice. I'm sure it looked dead enough when they pulled it up from the lake bed, but it wasn't. I certainly hope to never see anything like it again, but I'm almost positive it's out there somewhere in the Wisconsin woods. I remember one day in August. It was very warm out. It felt like it could have been a day in July. The sun was really pounding down on my head, so I grabbed a hat. To be honest, I hated wearing hats because I didn't feel like I could be in full awareness of my surroundings. The hat felt like it restricted my sight and hearing for some reason. So I do regret wearing it that day, but I didn't think I was going to be put into the situation that I had found myself in. I remember driving up around a bend, and I wanted to get out and look around, get some nice fresh air, see what things I could find growing. I was hoping to find some fungi. When you find fungi after a fire, it's really beautiful. The mushrooms eat away all the dead tree matter from the fire. They're warm colors. They just look so vibrant against the burnt black mess. There's nothing else like it. It's amazing, and you get a new appreciation for the things nature can do on its own. Anyways, I ended up finding patches of some pyrophilous fungi in different areas. That meant that the forest was healing itself, so I kept moving on. As I'm looking around, I hear some knocking noises coming a bit north of my location. It sounded like something knocking against wood, like wood against wood. It was hollow sounding almost. At first I didn't really mind it. But then I heard another knock. Wildlife in this particular area would not intentionally knock on something multiple times. That was a habit common in primates. There are no known primates in the Rockies, so I was confused. And then I heard it again. I started wondering if someone else was in the forest with me. They seemed to be mocking me by doing this, like they wanted me to be scared. I stood as quietly as I could. I wanted to be able to hear if something was heading in my direction. I didn't hear any footsteps, but I could definitely hear branches breaking in the distance. I couldn't tell what was making the noises. I couldn't even really tell which direction it was coming from at that point. I just stayed still and tried to prevent doing anything to draw attention to myself. And then, that's when I saw a rock fly past my head. Something was now throwing rocks at me. My heart sank into my stomach. About a dozen yards away was a huge, towering mass. It was dark, and it appeared to be covered in dark brown fur. I could have mistaken it for a bear, but I knew it wasn't. Its arms were much longer and thinner than a bear's, and so were its legs. Its shoulders were massive. And then the thing stood straight up. It was bipedal. It seemed completely natural for it, and it looked very much like a humanoid. It was quite frightening. I wasn't prepared for this at all. And before I knew it, the creature disappeared into the charred landscape, like a chameleon blending into its surroundings. It had a perfect color to camouflage into the burnt remains of the forest. From that point on, anytime I went to the park, I kept my eyes peeled. I wanted to be sure of my encounter. So I wanted to see it for a second time. But despite my best efforts, I never saw it again. I have a close friend that still works as a park ranger there. Occasionally, I'll ask if they've had any encounters or seen any strange creatures in the forest, but they always reply, "I guess I'm not as lucky as you." And I can feel that there is a bit of sarcasm there. But in a way, I do feel very lucky. Don't get me wrong, what happened was frightening, but it was also very magical. It was something that really made me see life in a new way. I have a better appreciation of life and all its secrets. If things like what I had witnessed were seen all the time, they'd lose their luster a bit. It's like the first time you see mushrooms growing out of dead, burnt debris. It's amazing, and I'll treasure it. When I was 16, I went to a party with a few friends. I didn't really care for high school parties, but my friends ended up dragging me along despite knowing I hated it. It was a typical high school party of high schoolers. My friends went about mingling and flirting with other partygoers while I found a comfy spot in the living room. I was bored out of my mind and about to ditch my friends when a few girls came into the living room giggling with a game board. They were conversing amongst themselves, saying they had to try this game. They didn't seem to notice me, and I didn't care at all and was enjoying just sitting in the background. Eventually, they got started as I was standing up to leave. One of them called me over, saying, "Hey, you, we need a fourth person, come play with us." I reluctantly figured whatever it would be better than moping around, and so I agreed. I sat down by them, and they opened the game board. Only it wasn't a game. I recognized the board, but had never used one myself. The word Ouija was at the top of the board, and the letters of the alphabet were scattered across. I was intrigued right away as they explained how it worked. If only I could have forecasted the events that would transpire soon after. One girl instructed each of us to place our hands on a wooden piece that had a clear lens at the top. Then the other girl asked loudly if there were any spirits that would like to communicate with us. Instantly, the wooden piece slid up to yes. I hadn't moved it, but I was totally convinced that one of the other girls nudged it in that direction, I chuckled to myself, thinking, all right, they're just trying to mess with me. It was my turn to ask it a question, but I wasn't sure what to ask. Then I thought, let me ask the name of who we were conversing with. The wooden piece shifted around the board as it stopped momentarily on letters, eventually spelling out the name Benjamin. Immediately, one of the girls pulled away and blurted out, No way, who made it move? We all denied moving it and asked her what had happened, why she got so freaked out. She was clearly shaken up, but eventually calmed down enough to tell us that was the name of her older brother, who had passed away a few years ago. At that point, I could tell she wanted to ask more questions and see if it was, in fact, her brother. She thought up a question only her and her family knew. We all placed our hands back on the piece, and she asked, How did you die? The piece shifted around and spelled out car wreck. Her face practically went white when that word was spelled out, which told me that it was correct. I was starting to think this wasn't at all fake, and that we had, in fact, made contact with her deceased brother. None of us were pressing on, asking any more questions since she was clearly shaken up. I could tell she was trying her best to suppress emotions but couldn't hold it in much longer and started crying. I felt bad and offered to get her tissues and some water. Having been secluded in the living room, I almost forgot a whole party was going on. I made my way through the crowd and found a walk-in pantry. I found tissues on a top shelf, and as I reached up for them, the door closed behind me and the lights turned off. I gasped and was fumbling for the light switch frantically. I switched the light back on and sighed, resting my head forward on the wall. I turned back around and was met face to face with a boy around 18, wearing a football jersey. I jumped backwards. "You scared me," I yelled. He apologized for the prank and asked if I came to these parties often because he never saw me before. I told him I was dragged into coming, but I never had a desire to be a party-goer. He seemed nice and I sort of wanted to chat longer, but I also wanted to get back to comfort that girl. Before I turned to walk away, he said, "Tell Mitchie I'm okay." I cocked my head to the side, thinking he must have mistaken me for someone else. I returned to the group of girls and gave them water and tissues. I asked the girl a few questions like how old her brother was and what he looked like. She said he was really into sports and especially loved football. She went on about their childhood growing up and all the memories they had together. In the moment, she seemed to really be connecting with me and so pulled out her phone, showing me a picture of them before a football game. I instantly froze. Her brother was the boy I ran into in the pantry. I stood up, shaking and confused. "What kind of sick prank is this?" I yelled. The others looked at me puzzled. I was mad. I don't know what came over me. It was like I lost control over my body. I could feel it happening to me, and then I said, "Mitchie, I'm okay now." It was my body. I was mouthing the words, but it wasn't my voice. A few seconds later, I snapped out of it and blurted out that I had just seen her brother in the pantry. We then all looked at each other like we knew exactly what had just happened, but none of us said it out loud. This happened almost 10 years ago, and that group of girls and I are very close friends to this day. Granted, we haven't touched a Ouija board since, but that day I believe my friend got closure and was able to move on in a way that she hadn't been able to before. It was the summer of 2019, and a storm came through a few days before we were set to arrive at our campsite. We were heading out for a long weekend and expecting 4 or 5 of our friends to join. We were worried about the conditions of the site after all the rain, but on a positive note, the rain brought relief from a heat wave that had been going on for weeks. The forecast now called for a cooler but clear weekend, so we decided to go camping anyway, despite the possible mess. So on Friday night we headed out, but we were talking so much on the way, we missed the turnoff for the campground and didn't arrive till after dark. Luckily, there was a full moon that night, and you could see the outlines of the trees around us. I remember thinking that this might not be such a bad place to camp, even if there is a bit of mud. We set up our tents, got some food cooking over an open flame pit, and settled in to enjoy the weekend, hopefully without rain. The hours passed with nothing but conversation to fill them until someone pointed out how noisy the woods were becoming. My ears perked up immediately at the sounds of birds chirping, insects buzzing, and other creatures doing who knows what in the night. I've spent plenty of time camping and on trails, but this was a first for this time of day. We were all starting to get tired at this point, and most of us began to drift off. I remember hearing one of my friends try to stifle his own yawns as he said goodnight. At least 2 others responded with their own goodnights, and we all decided it was time for bed. We rolled out our mats and sleeping bags and settled in. I couldn't tell you exactly when it happened because I fell asleep before everyone else, but someone must have said something because I remember hearing someone talking and another person shush them to be quiet. As I continued to drift in and out of consciousness, I heard my friends up at the campfire pit calling for me. It definitely sounded like something bad had happened, so I jumped up from my tent and ran towards the sound of their voices. When I arrived, they told me that they were sure something was lurking around our campsite. They had heard rustling in the bushes, but it wasn't until they saw a set of yellow eyes peering back at them that they got really scared. They all agreed to stay near the campfire and huddled around it so whatever was out there would know we were a group. I sat with my friends for over an hour as we tried to keep each other awake watching for this thing, whatever it was. At some point, someone mentioned that it might have left since it hadn't been seen again, but I think everyone just assumed it had gone into the woods, but might be coming back. At any rate, we didn't want to take the chance of letting ourselves get too relaxed and decided to take shifts, sitting out and keeping watch. Just after agreeing to the plan, the next thing to happen was the scariest minutes of my life. Off to our right was a loud growl, and the ground rumbled below our feet. Before we could even scream, the creature with the yellow eyes came rushing at us with such speed that we didn't even see him coming. It was so fast, and my memory is really blurry, but this creature looked like a dogman with black fur and glowing eyes. It was on top of us before we knew what happened, and it just kept going from one to the next, swiping its claws at us and stomping its feet. It worked its way around our group, charging at each and every one of us, although it never touched anyone. Each of us have different memories of that night, but I remember that all my head could focus on was the way this thing moved. It's like when you watch one of those dog agility courses and watch how they weave in and out without ever bumping into the others. This creature moved like that, so swift and stealthily, and only by standing on its back legs. It basically used its arms and hands like a human or an ape would. I remember thinking that this was a dogman, and it had to be at least 7 feet tall standing on his hind legs. Its yellow eyes burned through me even when it was looking elsewhere. Combine all of this with a growl so loud that I couldn't think clearly. The creature had finished its attack on everyone else, and then began walking toward me with his head down like a bull ready to charge at anyone foolish enough to stand in front of him. Just then, he stopped dead in his tracks and lifted his head up as if sniffing the air. Without saying a word, he looked over his shoulder and turned around to run into the woods. I've never seen anything move that fast or jump that high before. The strangest part was how quiet it was when it ran off. There weren't any footsteps like you would expect from something that heavy running through the middle of the forest at night. It made no sounds at all except for its breathing, which sounded more dog-like than human-like at this point, but still had an edge to it even if it didn't sound angry anymore. We all sat there shaking and unable to talk at first. And then one of us, I don't remember who said it first, said that they had heard the creature speaking in their heads. They said it was really strange, like they could understand its thoughts, but it wasn't English. They couldn't even put it into words. Others of us had the same experience, but some of us didn't. It's crazy how we each experienced it differently. Either way, we were all now terrified. Those of us who were able to function packed up our stuff, and then we all got out of there. For whatever reason, we all came to the conclusion that the creature just wanted us to leave his land, but he didn't want to hurt anyone. I wonder if we were too close to his lair, or maybe we had just surprised it. I guess we'll never really know. Thank God that nothing bad happened to any of us, but during the encounter it was nothing short of terrifying. We honestly had no idea if we would live or die, and that's not a feeling that goes away easily. It wasn't until the next day that we heard the rumors about Dogman sightings in the area and realized that's what came at us. Knowing that others had also had an encounter gave us the confidence to reach out about what happened. We tried to file a report with the police, but they dismissed our concern and told us to head back home and try to get some sleep since it was probably just a bear. None of us believed that it was just a bear. We all now know dogmen are real and they exist in this area. I was way too shaken up to even think about going camping for a few months, but now I'm back at it. I know, call me crazy, but somehow I feel that I'm more prepared and know what's likely to happen if I ever see one again.